Welcome everyone. I'm Eva Leinola from the OECD Secretariat, and welcome today to today's webinar on PFAS. So this webinar is brought to you in the context of the Global PFAS Group, who has been a group assembled under the OECD for a little over 10 years now. And the aim of this group is to share risk management approaches on PFAS, provide some technical information as well on PFAS substances, and to support a shift towards safer alternatives. So over the time, we've had different webinars on different topics related to PFAS. And today, you'll hear updates from two countries and also the Stockholm Convention. So updates on PFAS activities related to risk management in Australia and the UK, and then also updates from the Stockholm Convention. We had a similar webinar in December, which featured Japan, Canada, Israel, and the EU. And the recordings for that, as well as the slides, are available on our website. So you're welcome to access those as well. So we have three speakers with us today. Each of them will have about a 20-minute presentation, and then we'll have about 20 minutes time for questions following the three presentations. So I'd ask you to use the Q&A function to ask questions. You'll see that in your Zoom functionalities. So please use that in lieu of the chat to ask your questions. And then we'll be selecting some questions from that for the speakers after all three of them have presented. So I'd very much like to thank in advance all the three speakers who are sharing their experiences and approaches today. So we have with us Leah McKenzie, who's the Director of Environmental Contamination Advice and Standards of the Wildlife Waste and Environmental Permits Branch in the Department of Climate Change, Energy and the Environment and Water in Australia. So she'll be speaking first, and then we'll have a presentation by Edward Latter, who's from the Chemicals Policy Team in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK. And that will be followed by Keona Woodall from the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions from UNEP. So thank you all for joining, and I'll turn things over to Leah for the first presentation on activities in Australia. And thank you, Leah. I know it's very late in Australia where you are, so thank you for joining us today. So we're just bringing up your slides, and then I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Eva, and good evening, everybody. As Eva said, I'm Leah McKenzie. I'm the Director for Environment Contamination in the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water for the Australian Government. Next slide. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognise the continuing connection to land, water and culture. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge that tonight I am on Ngunnawal country in Canberra. Next slide. Some of this might be very obvious to some of you, but I thought I'd just do a bit of background. The issue with Australia is we have 3 levels of government. We have 6 states, 2 territory governments, and over 550 local councils. In Australia, each level of government provides different levels of services to Australians. And the Australian government is responsible for national matters that affect all Australians, such as foreign affairs, defence, immigration and trade. But the state and territory governments are responsible for issues that affect people in their jurisdiction, and that includes land management, planning, and in fact, contamination. And so because the Commonwealth has limited powers to develop and implement an Australian-wide national regulatory process for PFAS, the approach we have taken in Australia to respond to the PFAS contamination is to develop an interjurisdictional guidance document, which we call the PFAS National Environment Management Plan. And it has been developed by all Australian governments. So that's the 6 states, the 2 territories, the Commonwealth government, but we've also done it with New Zealand as well. There's been a series of different documentation, which you can see there. And currently we are finalising the National Environment Management Plan, or we refer to as PFAS NEMP 3.0, which we hope to publish shortly. Next slide. One of the issues in Australia, different to New Zealand, is that because it is one of the driest inhabited continents, we depend on groundwater a lot. On the map you've got is the areas that are coloured in dark orange is where 91 to 100% of the water being used in those areas is from groundwater. The lighter orange is where between 51 and 91% groundwater is used. This means many PFAS contaminated sites sit over these freshwater reserves. And so when we're looking at PFAS, we're looking also not just at surface water, but also the issues of impacting on the groundwater. Next slide. As I said, the PFAS NEMP has been developed in collaboration with New Zealand government. New Zealand is a member of the Heads of Environment Protection Agencies, which is actually the author of the PFAS NEMP. New Zealand has reports in that they're phasing out all PFAS from firefighting foams by the 3rd of December. And they're prohibiting all PFAS components and cosmetics imported or manufactured from the 31st of December next year. What is interesting in that map demonstrate to you is that the PFAS groundwater sampling conducted in 2022 was looked at where PFAS is located, and it was done through the local government in New Zealand. And it's as you can see, it's mainly in rural areas, and it was looking at where the PFAS has been sampled. Next slide. In Australia, the major areas where PFAS is likely to be is defence bases, mining operations, which we have a lot, fuel refineries, airports, and firefighting training grounds. It's been significant. We also have PFAS exposure sites from industrial processes, obviously like everybody else, commercial and consumer products, but probably biosolids is one of the issues that we're now currently dealing with. Because Australia's got such thin soil, because it's a very, very old continent, our lands are not particularly fertile for Western agricultural practices, and so we use a lot of biosolids to fertilise the soil. As PFAS has entered into the biosolids, this has become an issue for us to manage. Next slide, please. So although I'm going to talk about the PFAS NEMP very briefly, Australian government is doing other activities in other parts of the portfolio of the Commonwealth government. As I said, we do environmental guidance and legislation, which includes the PFAS NEMP. We have, not with me, but my colleagues in other parts of the department look at the international obligations in terms of PFAS management and remediation. And we also have legislation called the Industrial Chemical Environmental Management Standard, or ICHEMS, and that will be banning the import of PFAS and PFOA and PFHXS as of the 1st of July 2025. The Environment Department deals with the environment. The Department of Health issues the guidance values for PFAS, including the daily tolerable intake levels, which is important for our PFAS NEMP. They also, through one of their portfolio agencies, develop the drinking water guidelines and recreational guidelines and deal with food safety. The Department of Defence is undertaking a very large program at the moment in investigation and the management for all defence sites. The Department of Infrastructure is currently investigating the management of PFAS contamination on federally leased airports. And the states and territories and the EPAs are very involved with site-specific monitoring, managing on state and private land. Next slide. Defence has been, this is a map that is taken off, that was a snapshot as of, I think, October this year. where PFAS has been found off defence bases. They're across Australia. Defence has been looking at management activities, including the remediation of soil and source areas, the treatment of groundwater. They're trying to minimise the migration of PFAS in surface and groundwater. Where PFAS has got to impact on the drinking water of the communities that are surrounding defence land, they provide bottled and fresh water, and they do ongoing monitoring. They also do an enormous amount of investment into research and innovation, and they're looking at some very interesting things in terms of the extraction of PFAS and the management of it. There's a whole pile of work there that I do that my colleagues are dealing with very interesting work that they're undertaking in that space. Remediation is undertaken as far as is practical, and in some cases other measures such as supply of water is to reduce the community exposure to PFAS. Because as we all recognise, it is not possible to remove all PFAS from the environment. Next slide, please. The Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts is actually responsible for the federally leased airports. Although there's 20, 21, 22 federally leased airports, they are running a national PFAS investigation program of up to 37 civilian airports where the Australian government has historically provided firefighting services. The program is to identify the nature and the extent of PFAS across and develop management plans to deal with any of the identified risks. The investigations will generally include a preliminary site investigation, a detailed site investigation, PFAS management plan to monitor and manage the contamination, a human health and ecological risk assessment be undertaken if PFAS is detected above the guideline levels, and exposure pathways have been confirmed. These investigations are independently audited and being undertaken in alignment with the national requirements, including both the not only the PFAS NEMP, but also the National Environment Protection Assessment of Site Contamination measure as well. And the program has an investment by the Australian government of 130.5 million Australian dollars through to June 2027. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, the Industrial Chemicals Environment Management Standards, or ICHEMS, establishes a nationally consistent standards for managing the import, the manufacture, the export, the use and disposal of industrial chemicals. ICHEMS aims to prevent pollution in the first place by managing this, and it includes chemicals listed on the international conventions which Australia is party to. ICHEMS is based on the 7 schedules, and there includes banning or severely restricting the 3 PFAS substances: PFAS, PFOA, and PFHXS as of 1 July this year. And the bans are measures to prevent future harm to the environment and continuing circulation of the chemicals in the environment. Next slide, please. However, my section deals with the legacy issues of PFAS being in it. As I said before, the PFAS NEMP 3.0 is a cross-jurisdictional guidance document. It provides the framework for the management of PFAS contaminated materials and sites in all jurisdictions. It is a wide-ranging document, and it aims to manage PFAS and sites in a way that's consistent across all jurisdictions, is practical, and is risk-based. It is guidance, and guidelines, not regulations. And it's owned. There's a quick snapshot of the publication. It's just with the publishers at the moment, and it's designed to be used by government, industry, the community, and a range of stakeholders to inform them how to prevent, monitor, and manage PFAS contaminants. Next slide, please. The focus of PFAS NEMP has focused on 6 priority areas. So it's the international approach to the grouping of PFAS. There's the environment, data and monitoring, water and beneficial use of biosolids, PFAS in soils, health, wildlife and leaching, resource recovery and waste management, and site-specific application of PFAS NEMP guidelines. This is the third one that we've developed. The first one was developed in 2018. It was pretty slimline, I think about 45 pages. The next one that was published in 2020 by the heads of environment protection agencies was about 150 pages. This is quite over 200 pages, and this documentation is significantly larger again. What we've done is for each one of those themes, an expert in one of the jurisdictions took ownership over that and worked with the group. We took in a whole lot of consultation as well. So a lot of the content has been driven by experts. And in fact, my section is the one, although one of the chapters was one of the experts was sitting in my area, our big role was to coordinate that and to deliver it. Next slide, please. Don't need to, you can just take that on board and see it later. This is just the chapters of what we have done. As it's a guidance document, it covers a breadth of different topics and considerations when looking at PFAS. The issue is not all the sections of PFAS 2 were reviewed. We honed in on ones that we believed were of importance to update and to review. And so while it was considered a light touch, it's actually taken us nearly 5 years to get through the light touch. So there is future work to be done. Next slide, please. So as I said, it provides guidelines. One of the bits is we have pulled, to do the PFAS NEMP, we have pulled from other people's work and other guidance documents that are government standards across Australia and New Zealand. The ones we've used particularly are the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines, the Australian New Zealand Guidelines for Fresh and Marine Water Quality. The Drinking Water Guidelines are under review at the moment, and draft new guidelines came out in September last year. They anticipate they'll complete them in April, May this year, but we had to move forward on the existing published guidelines. The freshwater environmental water quality guidelines are under review as well, and the marine, as the marine ones. We've also based it on the National Environment Protection Assessment of Site Contamination Measure, or referred to quickly by us as the ASC NEPM, and also the New Zealand Resource Management Regulations. Next slide, please. So one of the bits we've done, although it's an environmental one, it has been based on the exposure for human health assessments. So we looked at the human-based guideline values using the tolerable daily intake, developed by the two health authorities. FSANZ is the Food and Safety of Australia and New Zealand. NHMRC is the National Health and Medical Research Council. And when we were doing it, the ones that has been significantly reduced was those with residential and garden soil. So as you can see from that table, we've separated out land use and have different measures according to how the interface with those with that soil would be. And we've reduced, as a consequence of further work since PFAS NEMP 2 was written, from 0.01 milligrams per kilo to 0.003 milligrams per kilo for PFOS and PFHXS, and for PFOL was reduced from 0.1 milligram per kilo to 0.06 milligrams per kilo. Next slide, please. We also looked at the direct and indirect exposure for environmental receptors. These updates made to the guidelines for soil. One of the bits we did was some work in terms of reptiles, which may seem unusual, but we've got one of the largest number of reptile species globally, and 90% of them are reptile species are endemic in Australia. So it's quite a unique biota that we need to protect. We also see them as a bit of a canary in the coal mine. So that they're very important to the health of the Australian ecosystem. So we've done, as you can see from the readings there, I'm not going to read them again because I will through them. But they direct exposure specifically for organisms that live in close proximity or live in soil. And so reptiles were deemed as one of the markers that we could utilise in this space. Next slide, please. The biota guidelines were based on those of Canada for NEPAD 3, but we've adjusted them to reflect the Australian context. We don't have beavers in Australia, we have platypi. And that was quite challenging finding out the diet of platypus because they eat in a very different way and they eat a large range of different intake. Their intake is varied, shall we say. There was some updates on the biota. Next slide, please. So the biosolids guidelines, which were new to the PFAS NEP, we looked at the potential risks of biosolids to human and ecological health, and investigated the human health and ecological risk, or the HERA, and they were used to identify the risk of key exposure paths on restricted use and unrestricted use of biosolid scenarios. Restricted use assumed that this edition of this section was a direct result of evolving science around PFAS and recent research confirming the presence of PFAS in the majority of the biosolids. It's of concern, as I've said earlier, because biosolids are used as fertiliser and applying them inadvertently cause PFAS contamination to the surrounding environment and the uptake through crops and animals. Extensive consultation was undertaken with the water industry because it's going to have a particular impact on them and the utilities to develop criteria and guidance which can be incorporated within the existing biosolids management framework. Can I have the next slide, please? But one of the things we've done is we've gone through what we've called the margin of safety, but we've seen this as a default. This is what they can achieve now, but we have flagged to the water industry that they will need to move to a margin of safety of 2 or 5, and that we haven't put a time frame on it. We want them to move there in a time that they are able to match without causing major commercial impact, but that this is where we are moving to ensure that we have the reduction of PFAS into the food chain. And they've accepted it. Next slide, please. So future work. So this is one of the things in the PFAS NEP is we flag what our future work will be. And these are some of the topics that have been identified as what we would move to in the future and for PFAS NEP 4. It's also envisaged, it's a very large document, it's quite detailed. There are questions as to whether this is as useful in the level of detail. We want to do a review and, as you do a version on version on version, you don't necessarily review the whole document. So that's one of the bits we're looking at. But these are the topics that we would be looking at for PFAS NEP 4. I hope that they'll be quite interesting to work to. And I think next slide, that should be. Thank you very much. Apologies for the rattling of papers for those who commented. I actually wasn't reading very much of my notes anyway. So thank you very much, Eva. I'll pass back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Leah, for that overview and sort of this advanced idea of what will be in Australia's NEP number 3, version 3, that will be coming out. I think it really, your presentation showed the necessity to have this multi-pronged approach towards risk management, everything from monitoring to management, including regulations, guidelines, standards, the remediation aspect, to tackle the range of exposure sources and uses and sites. So I did see there was a couple of questions that have come in for you in the question and answer. So we'll we'll look to address those during the Q&A session. For those, there was a couple of people who put a question into the chat. Just please use the Q&A function instead, as we'll only take the questions from there. Great. So thank you, Leah, and we'll move on to the UK presentation and come back to you in a moment. So now I'd like to welcome Ed Latter from the Chemicals Policy Team in DEFRA in the UK. So to give us an overview of activities on PFAS in the UK. So over to you, Edward.
Great. Thanks very much, Eva, for the introduction, and good day, everybody. So I work in the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in our Chemicals Policy Team. So I'll provide a bit of an overview of some of the work going on in the UK across PFAS. Next slide, please. So just in terms of the outline for the talk, I'll just provide a bit of a brief explainer in terms of some of the geography of the UK and how it's organised and the implications for chemicals management. I'll set a bit of the policy context overall that we're working in terms of environmental plans from a government level, and then run through a few of issues and regulatory activity across PFAS. Not time to go into detail in every single little area of PFAS, as it is quite wide-ranging, but just a few highlights of some of the key areas of activity at the moment. So yeah, next slide, thanks. So this may be kind of known by quite a few of you on the call, but well, this is a UK update, so probably worth just explaining that the UK there's 4 nations: Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And there's different powers and different lawmaking abilities within those countries. Some powers are reserved powers across the whole of the UK, but other powers, such as the environment, is one of those that's a devolved power. So there's a bit of a mix in terms of whether rules or regulations apply across the UK, across Great Britain, or within those individual 4 nations. But within that overall approach, we do work together across the UK and across the 4 nations. One of the ways in which we do this and set the approach to that is development of a common framework, which ensures a common approach is taken where powers intersect with policy areas of devolved competence. So this is important when thinking about different areas and different regulations on PFAS and how we work together across the UK, even where there may be decision-making powers within the 4 nations. Next slide, please. So just to set a bit of I suppose the policy context as well. We had a general election in July last year, and a new government coming to power. And one of the plans that were in place was the environmental improvement plan. This one thing that the government is doing is reviewing this environmental improvement plan. I think Britain is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. This government is charting a new course to develop an ambitious program to turn the tide and take action to protect our natural environment. So although this goal was published under the last government and under review, I think it still sort of provides some level of understanding of the overall benefits of what we're trying to achieve in terms of chemicals management. So making sure that chemicals are safely used and managed, and that chemicals entering the environment are significantly reduced. And the infographic just shows a little bit of some of the areas in terms of tackling pollution at source, monitoring, and the circular economy as well. And this is another area that I won't go into detail, but just note in passing that that's one of the area that our Secretary of State has announced to work on as a priority, is the circular economy. Obviously relevant for PFAS. I won't talk about that today, but just in passing in terms of some of the policy context. But next slide, please. So what does this mean for PFAS when we're thinking about kind of PFAS overall in the UK? Well, I think one of the things that recognizes that there is this system of sources, pathways, and receptors. One of the areas of work is really just work to assess levels of PFAS occurring in the environment, thinking about where their sources are, and assess those risks to inform policy and regulatory approaches. I'll talk a bit more about monitoring, and this diagram on the screen, illustrative rather than comprehensive, I would say, in terms of what we can think of as in terms of the different bits of this PFAS system. And a couple of things to note, I think, is just the connectivity between the different parts, and also the connection between the environment and human health. So I'll talk a bit later about drinking water. But really, this just shows to demonstrate kind of the complexity of the PFAS system, and needing to consider the various different priorities for action to address the various risks. And I'll now kind of, next slide, please, move on to talk a bit about some of the regulatory actions, talking a bit around monitoring the environment. Where does that get to in terms of understanding as a line of evidence in terms of sources, and turning that into regulatory action, and then just pick up 3 sort of specific examples of where there is action occurring around domestic implementation of the Stockholm Convention, drinking water, and I'll talk finally about some of the restrictions through the regulation of UK REACH. So next slide, please. So this is thanks to Environment Agency colleagues for this slide. So the Environment Agency undertakes sort of monitoring across England, and it's important to know kind of what PFAS we find in the environment, and where it is to inform policy approaches. The Environment Agency now routinely monitors for 48 specific PFAS. And as you can see on the slide there, to date, there have been more than 2,000 groundwater samples and 1,000 surface water samples have been analysed. This data is openly available. I think the main takeaways from this slide is firstly looking at the range of different PFAS that are found through this monitoring. PFOA, unsurprisingly, is one of the ones that's found more often, and PFAS as well is quite high up there as well. But there's a range of different PFAS that are found across the environment. The contamination is fairly widespread, so it's found in 88%. Some PFAS is found in 88% of freshwater samples and 47% of groundwater samples. So this is a important kind of line of evidence to understand where PFAS is and which different PFAS that we're seeing. Next slide, please. As well as undertaking samples and just the routine work of going out, taking samples and analysing samples, it's also important that we improve our methods for understanding which PFAS are out there, and expand the monitoring capabilities. And so here's just some examples of some of the analytical developments that the Environment Agency have undertaken over quite a few years now. So going all the way back to 2014. With a screening method for surface and groundwater being developed, generally expanding the number of PFAS that are being analysed for through 2021 and 2022, and then in 2023 moving more into freshwater and saline fish as well, to understand not just the water samples but also in biota, and more recently investigations into areas such as top assay. So this is more of a what called I would refer to as sort of a total PFAS sort of method. So not just looking at specific individual PFAS, but looking at a more of a way of grouping PFAS, and also developing methods to look at trifluoroacetic acid and ultra short chain PFAS. So the monitoring baseline that we have and data is really important as a line of evidence, and that's continue to update with new samples, but also with analytical developments as well. Next slide, please. As well as environmental monitoring, that's just one source of data and one line of evidence that we can use. One of the multi-year projects that the Environment Agency have been delivering over the last few years is to develop a multi-criteria analysis and developing a GIS sort of tool that scores potential source sites. Really, the idea of this is to look across sort of different sources, different lines of evidence, and develop a risk screening assessment to understand where the legacy sources are. This was delivered at the national England scale, and is also connected to the risk. So this really provides a very powerful tool that brings together lots of evidence in one way that helps kind of understand the different risks from different sites, not just environmental monitoring, but other lines of evidence as well. And through this, this identified some of the main source sites, so air transport sites, fire training, landfills, and then some chemical sectors, and also COMA, which is to do with large sites, storage of hazardous materials. So this really provides a very solid kind of evidence base through which further regulatory action can be taken. And next slide, please. So one of the examples here where this is now provided the base to take more regulatory action is looking at commercial airports. So this falls under our the environmental permitting regulations, and using those regulations and the evidence that airports are a significant source of PFAS. This has now started a process of reviewing permits, of 26 in total. The Environment Agency engaging with the airport sector, and also serving what's known as Regulation 61 notices. So these are used by the Environment Agency to obtain information relating to environmental permits. This sets out for each permit holder what information is required and a timescale within which it should be provided. I think the takeaway here is that this is about kind of asking those responsible to gather information, and asking kind of the airports to provide that information to inform an overall sort of best risk assessment. That risk assessment can then be used to understand what reviews, what changes to the permit may be needed, and what actions may be taken to address any risks that are found. Next slide, please. So moving on a bit from understanding some of the work that I suppose is primarily around legacy sources, and understanding kind of the pollution that's out there in the environment. Another important area of work is thinking about, okay, actually stopping the sources and stopping the uses of PFAS where it's needed. And one of the ways through which we do this is implementing the Stockholm Convention that the UK is party to. So we already had existing restrictions on use of PFOA and PFOS. And in 2023, new legislation came into force on a third PFAS added to the Stockholm Convention. That's PFHXS. So this is now prohibited from use, manufacture, and placing on the market in GB. There is also more legislation coming through. So in October 2024, there was a statutory instrument laid in Parliament, or approved by Parliament following a public consultation in 2023. This was covered quite a range of things. So some non-PFAS related POPs work, but also a number of technical changes to the annexes of the POPs regulations. In particular, for PFAS, this includes the introduction of a limit specifically targeted at firefighting foam mixtures containing PFOA to ensure that the environmentally sound disposal of any remaining stockpiles of these foams. So this is just a demonstration really of kind of some of the legislation that's being taken through that implements the Stockholm Convention, and really helps to address some of I suppose the better known and more widely used PFAS and restrictions there. Next slide, please. Another example, just in terms of regulatory practice, is around drinking water. So as I kind of mentioned the geography earlier, in terms of the four nations in the UK, so the Drinking Water Inspectorate covers England and Wales. So this is kind of what I'm talking about in this particular example. And they have kind of a fairly long history of providing guidance to the industry regarding requirements to undertake risk assessments for PFAS. This goes back to sort of formal guidance back in 2021. And I think the key points here is that drinking water in England and Wales is of an exceptionally high standard. The DWI play a key role in maintaining that, and the advice and the guidance on PFAS really provides clear guidelines to the industry in terms of what their responsibilities are to ensure that water remains wholesome. And this guidance doesn't stand still as well. It was updated in August in 2024. The main change here was that to introduce a provision for that the guideline value was updated to 0.1 micrograms per litre for the sum of 48 named PFAS. So the 48 named PFAS is what the guidelines require the water companies to assess for, and this summing thing was the update into 2024. Just in terms of just for reference, I won't talk about in any detail here, but worth noting just in passing that in Scotland, the responsibilities for the drinking water quality regulator in Scotland and their guidance and their rules around drinking water are slightly different to that in England and Wales, and likewise for the drinking water inspectorate in Northern Ireland as well. But I won't go into detail on that. It's more wanted to focus just a bit on talking around what the updates, the guidance were in England and Wales undertaken by the DWI. And if anyone's interested in reading more about that, all the guidance is available. And the Chief Inspector of Drinking Water publishes a report every year, and there was one published in July last year, which contains quite a lot on PFAS. Next slide, please. So the final piece of work I want to talk about is quite a big undertaking, thinking about a range of different regulatory management options that could be taken on PFAS. And one of the big pieces of work that's happened over the last few years is started with the regulatory management options analysis on PFAS that was undertaken by the Environment Agency and our Health and Safety Executive, who are the agency for UK REACH. This was a big piece of work to really look across PFAS in more detail, think about what different regulatory management options there were, assessing the risk. The RMOA covered all PFAS from a starting point, so it covered kind of polymers, F-gases, PFCs, etc. The definition of PFAS used as in this has had a fair bit of attention. So I'll just touch on that, and really it's used the OECD definition as a starting point. It did use a slightly narrow working definition as a pragmatic choice to develop the analysis, but just worth noting that that doesn't mean that any sort of future restrictions need to be bound by that definition. The restrictions in future can cover still have the ability to cover a wider range of PFAS. One thing it did do was take a grouping approach within that overall definition that it used. It looked at kind of breaking it down into subgroups based around what we call kind of arrowhead parts of PFAS. It didn't include already restricted uses or legacy contamination, other than where that provides useful evidence to inform the analysis. The main conclusions really were that when looked at from a group level, the hazard data was quite sparse for most groups. And there's also quite a lot of uncertainty in the emissions exposure and risk. So one of the main principles really that it recommended using was the precautionary principle, particularly given the very high persistence of PFAS. Next slide, please. So in terms of the recommendations, what were the recommendations coming out of this? So this is in April 2023. So the main recommendations were a joined up approach across government and with external stakeholders. We have taken that forward. We've had kind of stakeholder groups that have been informative in developing our PFAS approach. We also, continue to work across government. But the main two are probably around the use of our regulatory tools, in particular use of UK REACH restrictions for a wide range of PFAS, including firefighting foams and consumer articles. Firefighting foams has been the main focus there, and we're currently considering what further measures may be needed on PFAS beyond the firefighting foams. And there's also been some work just further understanding the evidence to take forward these recommendations around the use of UK REACH. Next slide, please. So yeah, I think I've covered a fair bit of this, but just to say, I think the firefighting foams restriction, that restriction dossier is in preparation by our regulators. This is due for completion quite soon, so in March. It included a call for evidence in 2024 to gather evidence on the use of firefighting foams and the risks. Following the completion, there'll be a 6-month consultation on this particular restriction, but really this is quite a key step in tackling one of what was identified as one of the main sources of PFAS to the environment. And as I said, there's further work on evidence of uses and risks in PFAS to inform future measures, but it's still to be determined what those are. Next slide, please. So this just sets out some of a bit of the process. I won't talk this through, but just to show kind of where we're at. We're towards the end of that 12-month process of the restriction dossier, and then there'll be a consultation. So there's still a fair amount of work to be undertaken before a final decision and legislation, but just further information really to show where we're at in the overall process. A lot of work has gone into it already for firefighting foams coming into towards the end of that restriction dossier process. Next slide, please. So that was a quick kind of canter through some of the areas of work that have been worked on in the UK in terms of a regulatory approach to managing the risks from PFAS. I think a few of the key areas about thinking about how we restrict PFAS, work towards restricting PFAS in firefighting foams has been a priority, but also a number of other regulations and evidence building in other areas helps build an overall kind of approach. I haven't mentioned sort of much in other areas around sort of things like human health, but obviously there is work going on in that area. In particular, if you're interested, you can look at our committee on toxicity, are undertaking a review of some of the toxicity around PFAS, which will help provide kind of clear advice on aspects to do with the health risks as well. So there's quite a lot I didn't cover, but hopefully gives a sense of some of the priorities, some of the areas that we're working on in the UK on PFAS. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ed, for also that overview from the UK. Indeed, it's hard in 20 minutes to cover all the different areas of activity. So appreciate that that challenge. So I think we heard a number of elements from the UK, from monitoring to develop evidence base for risk management to some of the risk management activities underway for different sectors, and also drinking water guidelines that have been developed. But then also this risk management options approach document that has been done looking at wider and broader coverage of PFAS on the market in Great Britain. So there has been a number of questions that have come in for you as well, Ed. So we'll look to address some of those after Kay's presentation. So you'll have heard Leah and Ed refer to aligning their activities also with the Stockholm Convention. So Kay is going to give us an overview of the latest updates from the Stockholm Convention and PFAS substances that are being addressed under the convention. So Kay, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Kay from the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, and I'll give overview of the work done at the global level, as well as some of the activities in developing countries. Next, please. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So Stockholm Convention scope of chemicals are persistent organic pollutants, and there is a set of criteria to identify those chemicals. So the convention, starting with 12 chemicals, now covers 34 substances, including some of the PFAS. Next, please. I should say, indeed, some of the key PFAS, as we saw in the previous presentation, also PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS were appearing in top 5 or top 6 of the detected chemicals from freshwater or groundwater. I also saw perfluorohexanoic acid, which is known to be used as a substitute for long-chain perfluorocarboxylic acids, the substances that are currently under review and proposed for listing in Annex A to the convention, which will be considered at the upcoming BRS COPs in May this year. So under the Stockholm Convention, of those thousands of PFAS, 3 sets of chemicals are currently controlled: PFOA and PFHXS in Annex A for elimination, and PFOS in Annex B for restriction. Next, please. The implication of listing under the Stockholm Convention includes a number of control measures. The key control measure relates to intentional releases, which is about use, production, import, and export. So once listed in Annex A, it is expected to be prohibited except for the exempted applications. The specific exemption has time limitation, while acceptable purpose has no expiry date. And then for specific exemptions, parties needs to register, and most of the applications, they are available for 5 years, and there is a review process to request for another 5-year extension. Since the PFAS are not listed under Annex C, the control measures related to unintentional releases are not relevant. However, it is known that there are unintentional releases of PFAS during the process of manufacturing and so on, and therefore the recommendations related to BAT-PEP and so on would be still quite helpful for controlling PFAS releases into the environment. And another very important control measure relates to management of stockpiles and waste. We've heard a lot about application of PFAS in firefighting foams. And as you know, firefighting foams are meant to be stored for emergency use, and many countries find to have stockpiles, large quantities of stockpiles of firefighting foam containing some of the PFAS already listed under the Stockholm Convention. So that's Article 6. Next, please. And then parties are also required to develop national implementation plans once chemicals are listed within 2 years time frame. This should include, for example, inventories of the chemical, to understand how much of such chemicals exist in your country, the situation regarding trade, and so on. And this will help countries to identify the needs for registering specific exemptions. And another requirement is to provide a report on the status of implementation of control measures. This is every 4 years, national reporting. And then the conference the parties conduct the effectiveness of the Stockholm Convention every 6 years. And for this purpose, there is a mechanism called Global Monitoring Plan that measures POPs levels in core media, which are air and also human tissue, like blood and human milk survey. Next, please. So let's look at a bit more detail about the PFAS that are controlled under the Stockholm Convention. The first one that was listed under the convention was PFOS, salts, and PFOS-F. The PFOS being the broken down product, and PFOS-F is the mother compound. So with this listing, the understanding is that all PFOS precursors, 96, are covered by the listing of PFOS salts and PFOS-F. The convention provides examples of some of the salts, but this is a non-exhaustive list. And it's listed under Annex B with restrictions. So it had started with 6 acceptable purposes and 12 specific exemptions. But through the process for evaluating the continued need for exemptions, the Conference of the Parties managed to amend the listing of PFOS and limiting these exemptions to just only 1 acceptable purpose for sulfuramide in insect bites for leaf-cutting ants, and 2 specific exemptions, hard metal plating and firefighting foam. And I mentioned that there is a process that allows requesting extension of specific exemption. And following this process, the Republic of Korea has submitted request for extension for another 5 years. So it's a bit confusing, but for many parties, the PFOS listing, the amended listing, has entered into force on 3rd of December 2020. So normally those specific exemptions will expire on 3 December 2025. For the Republic of Korea, the country that had made the declaration that the amendment only enter into force for them upon ratification, the entry into force date is a little bit later than many other parties. But still, it's 3 June 2026, and therefore it was necessary for the upcoming COP to take a decision on the extension. So if it is granted, then it's 3 June 2026 plus 5 years. So the request is only for firefighting foam application only, and the Republic of Korea has explained that they have large quantities of stockpiles that they think that it will be challenging to meet this deadline for managing them all in an environmentally sound manner. And so this was their motivation for requesting the extension. The report by the Secretariat is supposed to be sent to all parties and observers today, so please take a look. But it's already available on the website that is accessible from the link there. Next, please. The second set of PFAS is PFOA, it's salts and PFOA-related compounds, and it is listed with definition that is quite complicated, but in short, PFOA-related compounds are any substances that degrade to PFOA. So there are, more than 300. It says indicative list has 369, but I just checked. It has 375 substances at the moment. The version October 16 of 2024. So there are several PFOA-related compounds that are known to degrade to PFOA in the environment, but PFOA is the substance that has all the POPs characteristics and therefore needs to be controlled as per the Stockholm Convention provisions. And for this purpose, this indicative list has been developed to support countries taking control measures, and it has been sent yesterday for comments by parties and observers. I have seen in the previous presentations about the measurement of PFAS, and the UK has indicated that they have 48 specific PFAS that they are looking at to measure. But there are many other PFOA-related compounds or PFHXS-related compounds or PFOS precursors that are not very difficult to measure in the environment, as they could degrade quite relatively in short periods to the broken down substance like PFOA, PFHXS, and PFOS. And therefore, it makes sense to measure those broken down products. But if the country needs to control or enforce those chemicals in consumer products, for example, then it is necessary to have analytical standards to detect at least commercially used PFOA-related compounds or PFHXS-related compounds, which could be possible through cooperation with industry. They are developing or using these chemicals. So similar to PFAS, the Republic of Korea submitted request for extension of using PFOA for firefighting foam purpose, and this will also be considered at the next conference of the parties. Next slide, please. Okay, so PFOA has 9 applications as specific exemptions, and all of them, except for pharmaceutical products purpose, will expire for most of the parties on 3 December 2025, including for firefighting foam. The one application that has longer period is specific exemption for the use of PFOI, perfluoro, this octane with iodide, and for the production of PFOB for the purpose of producing pharmaceutical products. So this is the use that was considered as essential, requires longer period for replacement, and therefore the COP agreed to have more than 5 years period. It is specified in the convention text that COP, starting from COP 13, they will review the continued need. And therefore, parties and observers will be invited to submit information by 1st of December 2025. And there will be a report about the continued need for the use of PFOI for the production of PFOB. All right, next, please. The third set of PFAS controlled by the Stockholm Convention is PFHXS, this hexane form. This set of chemicals was listed with no specific exemptions. So here I have listed the information on the use of PFHXS, its salts and related compounds that were sort of identified during the review process by the POPs Review Committee. But the conclusion was that alternatives are available for these applications, and therefore it was listed with any specific exemptions. And therefore, countries parties to the Stockholm Convention must prohibit production use of PFHXS, its salts, and PFHXS-related compounds. And then, as I mentioned earlier, also for the purpose of enforcement, the analytical standards to detect commercially used PFHX-related compounds or previously used those substances may be necessary. Here, similar to PFOA, there is an indicative list that contains 176 substances. Okay, all right, great. Here I have the QR code that will lead you to find those lists. Next, please. So under the global monitoring plan for POPs, it was initially the core media was air and human tissue only, but in order to detect hydrophilic substances, water was added. And since the previous GMP3 report that was issued in 2023, the concentration levels of PFOA, PFHXS, and PFOS has been included in the report. I mean, the data sets are still very limited, and also the analytical methods are quite complex. So it's very difficult to draw much conclusion from the available data yet. But the remediation of PFAS contaminated sites is generally very costly because of the persistence and complexity of the chemicals. So it is really much more recommended to take action rather than trying to remediate the contaminated sites. Next, please. Now, in my next few slides, I would like to share with you some information on technical assistance projects that we have been conducting. One has been going on since early last year in Vietnam. So Vietnam has registered for all specific exemptions on industrial chemicals which were available for PFOS, PFOA, DecaBD, hexane heptabD, tetra and pentabD, and SCCPs, because they have, since 2020, very strict POPs regulation. But while some exemptions have a duration longer than 5 years, like DecaBD has a spare parts exemption that for vehicles and aircraft that is quite much longer than 5 years, but many of them have already expired, like short-chain chlorinated paraffins, or nearly expiring, like PFOS and PFOA. So in order to support Vietnam to assess the real status of production use and also availability of alternatives, and then evaluate the need for exemptions, this project was started, and with the support from the governments of European Union and governments of Sweden and Norway, as well as other guidance documents that have been already developed with support by other donors. Then here the assessment report has all the recommendations on each and every applications, but just overview for sulfuramide, the use for control of leaf-cutting ants. They have concluded that they can withdraw from acceptable purpose and they are still in the process of submitting this notification. But this is one of the good outcome of this project. For metal plating, they have identified several metal plating establishments, and they have also identified major challenges such as awareness raising costs and the complexity in supply chain and enforcing it in small and medium enterprises. For the metal plating, more challenge they have found were on chlorinated paraffins, as in view of the upcoming consideration on listing of medium chain chlorinated paraffins. But they have also looked at how they can phase out PFOS use in metal plating. Firefighting foam, also they have assessed how much of the stockpiles still exist. However, through this project, it was confirmed that their data is still very limited, and they would require further assessment of the quantities of firefighting foam still remaining in the country that require management. Next, please. Yes, so continuing with the firefighting foams containing PFOS or PFOA, they have identified again the need for developing more detailed inventory, conducting stakeholder consultation, and then providing technical training that is necessary for the establishments using such firefighting foams. Managing and safely destroying stockpiles containing firefighting foam with PFOS and PFOA. This is indeed the challenge also expressed by the Republic of Korea and was in a very similar situation in Vietnam. Next, please. Textile has also been identified as another large volume application of PFOA, and there are some alternatives available, for example, short-chain PFAS, less toxic but still persistent. There are also other innovative solutions and so on. However, they have expressed a serious challenge with awareness of those stakeholders maybe using PFAS in textiles, because they have many small and medium-sized enterprises in textile industry in Vietnam. So that's some of the recommendations and phase-out plan that are listed in this slide. Next, please. Right, so that report contains all of the assessment for 9 applications, specific exemptions for PFOA, as well as PFOS. So if you are interested in that report, please let me know. I can share. It's still a draft form, but it could be of use if your country may be in a similar situation. And then in the last few slides, so there is a new project funded by Jeff for fortifying infrastructure for responsible extinguishments, the very excellent acronym FIRE project. This will be conducted in Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa with cooperation of ICAO and implemented by UNEP. Next, please. Right, so there are a few components. One component that will be working on regulatory framework, aligning with ICAO provisions. And then the second component to introduce safer alternatives. And lastly, knowledge management and sharing lessons learned. So hopefully we will start with some of those African countries, but we know that many other countries may be in similar situation, and hopefully we can scale up or replicate these project outputs in other regions. Next, please. Right, so this is my final slide. I've just summarized the recommendations from the POPs Review Committee on listing long-chain PFCAs, their salts and related compounds, which will be considered at next conference of the parties. And you can access the list of long-chain PFCAs with little explanatory note prepared by the Intersessional Working Group on POP-ROC that just went out for comments by 9 June 2025. It's quite important because some of the long-chain PFCAs related compounds are also PFOA-related compounds if you follow strictly the definition of these related compounds, because they degrade to either substances. And therefore, in terms of regulatory policy, how this can be handled could be one of the important topic for consideration when it comes to listing long-chain PFCAs. All right, thank you very much. I think this was my last slide.
Thank you, Kay, for providing the update on the number of activities of the Stockholm Convention. And it's also interesting to see now how the exemption provisions for a number of the first listed PFAS-related chemicals are coming to an end, and also the activities that you have underway to support additional countries in meeting out those phase-out commitments under the convention. And also, you noted several times the need for analytical standards to support monitoring and risk management activities as well. And with that, we're ending the end of our time for the webinar. So I'd like to thank all of the three speakers today for sharing the approaches in Australia, the UK, and the updates from the Stockholm Convention as well, which impacts countries globally around the world. And also thank everyone who participated in the webinar. My colleague has posted the links in the chat for where you can find you'll be able to in the future find the slides and the recording of the webinar, and also where you can find more information on the OECD work on PFAS as well. Also, if you're a country that's listening to this and would like to share your approaches, don't hesitate to contact the OECD Secretariat as well. You can contact myself, and we can look to have a future webinar of additional countries. So that's all for today. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.